My name's Charles Alessi. I'm Chief Clinical Officer of FIMS, and I'm delighted to be talking to you today around the response to COVID-19. But the response with a twist, because I've been looking at this really from a global perspective. HIMS is a global organization whose vision really is to realize the full health potential of every human everywhere. And because of that reason, we're in a position where we have been invited to most nations on earth to comment on and to get involved in some of the issues to do with data and technology around the response to the COVID pandemic. So let's talk about the COVID pandemic. Of course, you know everything about it. It really is a pandemic like no other, a child of the 21st century, which largely outstripped the ability of countries to manage its effects, with some exceptions, I might add. But why is this? And I think it really is because of the fact that it is rather different to other pandemics. It's asymptomatic transmission, and also the fact that it's transmitted mainly around a respiratory, through a respiratory medium, and also through the front of the nose rather than right down into the chest. That makes an enormous difference. But anyway, what are the main factors, really, if we have to be thinking in terms of looking forward, that would determine success in managing a pandemic? And I think these factors are really, some of which are self-evident, but I'm going to give some illustrations from some countries that did things in a really remarkable way. So they are the value of a short-term memory, the value of preparation, both in terms of having the infrastructure and supplies ready, but also in terms of actually having deployed rather than theoretically having deployed. The value of real communication with a population and really taking them with you. And of course, that magic word, trust. The value of protecting your workforce. The value of managing non-COVID conditions contemporaneously. People have come a cropper. Really because all the efforts were on the COVID population rather than on the non-COVID population. The value of managing care in the community, both in terms of vulnerable groups and also in terms of care homes. And then, of course, the value of already being on a journey towards digital transformation in health and care, because you're in a far better position to deliver better outcomes. So let's now think in terms of what does this actually mean? And I'm really going to take you around the world now. I'm going to start with the Asia Pacific and then move to Europe, because I think between those two continents, we get a sense of illustrating all these issues and what they actually mean. So let's start with Asia Pacific. And the first thing I want to talk about is Taiwan. And I say what they did was flicking a switch, because it was really quite remarkable. In 6 hours between midday or just after midday on the 31st of December to 6 p.m. on the same day, they had already set up a dedicated place within the airport for visitors coming in from Wuhan. They had already set up a dedicated taxi rank to take them to the dedicated hotels where they could have dedicated foods for 2 weeks, where they could have had an app downloaded on their mobile phone to ensure they were mobilely tethered, as well as everything else which went around it. It was remarkable. And it really was remarkable seeing a government flick a switch, because that in essence what it was. Things just happened, but why did they happen? And if there's something which is abundantly clear going around every country in the Asia Pacific and as well as the rest of the world, it's that people who have had a recent coronavirus, in other words, SARS, MERS, also H1N1, plus also some civil emergencies, events like earthquakes, or in New Zealand, the volcano exploding, where there was already a process set up which had been used recently in terms of managing emergencies. Things worked remarkably well compared to places which were stable enough not to have actually done it for a while, where memory of how things actually work may not have been as good as we thought they would have been. So I think Taiwan was fantastic in terms of flicking a switch. Let's move on. Japan. A couple of things about Japan which still really intrigue me. And I call them the enigma, because they really are an enigma when it comes to understanding how they managed, really, through their really understated approach to a degree, their reverse cluster investigations, the 3 C's which they talked about around the population, crowded places, avoiding them, in other words, ensuring that when they were in crowded places, they were protected. You know, all the work they did really came to something, plus the role of government, which I compare to a midwife, because in essence, what they were doing, particularly in the beginning, is managing to get small suppliers, which they were relying on for PPE, to marry up with larger conglomerates to really deliver the capacity and capability which they needed to get the PPE they required. And the role of government there was really quite extraordinary. Let's move on. South Korea. What would you expect? Technology on steroids is the way I would describe it, with booths, with positive pressure in the community, all sorts of stuff. But there's something about South Korea which is rather special, and that's their foresight in legislation. After the MERS outbreak, the rights of the citizen were to a degree subsumed to the rights of the citizen to other citizens, which enabled them to implement track and trace technology around managing a pandemic in that way, without having to worry about the issues which concern us all in terms of personal privacy, in terms of the ability of somebody to track you. Those were suspended, and that legislation was agreed before the pandemic. So suddenly they just turned it on, and they could marry data and information from government in terms of eligibility for services, together with personal data from mobile phones, even going on and adding in data from companies associated with credit cards, financial data, and they could really manage the pandemic well. I'm not saying that's the answer for everybody, and I'm not saying that's the answer forever, but to be in a situation where you can suddenly switch it on and switch it off is really very, very good. And of course, Singapore. How can we ignore Singapore? And I really think the perfect first wave response is what comes to mind in terms of the way they approach it. Singapore has always been the big laboratory of the world, I think. This city-state of a relatively small population, but with such flair and imagination in terms of getting everything together and deploying it in real time is a wonder. Let's move to Europe now. Germany. Everybody talks about Germany, the great success. I think it's really, really laudable what the Germans have done. And you know, I am not by any stretch of the imagination saying I'm less than impressed, but they started from a very big infrastructure. We need to remember that. So they had a lot of ventilated beds, a lot of nursing, a lot of everything, a lot of testing. And so perhaps the faults that existed weren't immediately obvious. Italy, completely different. 2 regions, Lombardy and Veneto. In Lombardy, real disaster. They were unlucky enough to be the first place to get COVID badly, and for that reason got into all sorts of trouble associated. But next door in Veneto, they didn't admit people and ventilate them quickly. They tried to keep them at home. They tested a lot. They traced a lot, and they had a different result. Denmark, they closed down and closed down fast. They did it a week or two before, exactly a week actually, before the United Kingdom did, with the effect that they actually managed to contain that first wave substantially better. And Sweden, of course. Sweden, another of the enigmas, another of the places to watch. People say it was really not very well managed. I wonder, and I wouldn't be surprised if at the end of the day, Sweden is the place we'll look to for the future. There's no single recipe that can be applied in any way. You have to contextualize it. Of course, there are big effects of the pandemic. We're moving to a digital first situation after a long time hoping to get there. And I think this is our real opportunity. And most important for all of us now, we need to rediscover that short-term memory, because by having that short-term memory, we'll be in a far better place, I think, to manage the next waves of this pandemic. Thank you.